Hello and welcome to the show with me, Gillian Gossel, for Blockleaders.io. Today I am very pleased to welcome a fellow countryman, although now UK man almost. I don't know, are you still Irish, or are you both?
Still Irish, I'm still Irish.
And Eric Lonergan.
Surface.
Yeah, Eric Lonergan, who is a macro hedge fund manager, economist and writer. And his most recent book is AngryNomics, which has been written with Mark Bly. This book, and I haven't read it, but I'm your biggest fan that hasn't read your book, but I've been reading all about it. I haven't got my hands on it yet. This book is amazing. It is just the stuff that I've read about it. I can't wait to actually read it. It's a terrible admission to make.
I hope it doesn't disappoint you, Gillian.
Yeah, no, but it's all about, it's about anger. So, and you divide the anger into the public and the private. Don't explain that a little bit, sort of how you set up the scene.
So one of the things that inspired the book really, and the name AngryNomics was, at a certain point, Mark and I both, he's a political economist, he's a professor in the US. I'm an economist by training. And we had a kind of theory about the world, to try and explain what was going on in politics and economics. And the turning point was, at a certain point, he said, what are we going to say about anger? And it was just one of those key moments. We suddenly both of us kind of reflected and thought, we don't really know anything about it. So it's sort of obvious, and everybody talks about it, assumes it, people are getting angry, and yet we really don't have a deep understanding of it. And so we went away and we did 6 months of research, reading everything we could find on anger, from neuroscience, social psychology, moral philosophy. And in one way it was very enlightening, in another way it was actually very disappointing, because I came away thinking, there is actually no clear synthesis that draws all this stuff together and explains anger to you. Almost everywhere it assumes we know what anger is. And on reflection, we ended up with these kind of two distinctions. One is between private anger and public anger. And then within public anger, there's these two types. There's the anger of angels and the anger of devils. So which do you want me to start with? We can talk a little bit about the private public, or we can talk about the types of public.
Start off with the private public and then on to the public, because I've got some questions to ask you on the public, although I very much agree with your thinking and your writing, but I want to ask a few devil's advocate questions in that space. But so let's divide the private and the public. Okay,
so the first thing that became clear is that when you look at public expressions of anger, usually very frequently they're associated with righteousness. So for example, if you stopped an Extinction Rebellion protester, and you said, why are you getting angry? They would almost have righteous indignation. So they would sort of say, you should be angry too, because we're destroying our environment, we're polluting our airs, our rivers, our streams, we're destroying the planet for future generations. There's an injustice, and it's a kind of appropriate response. If a colleague of yours, or a friend or a family member suddenly starts getting angry all the time, you're more likely to take them to one side and say, listen, is everything okay? Yeah. So this is very interesting. These appear to be very, very different forms. So in the private sphere, when somebody's getting angry a lot, it may indicate that there's something going on internally, that they're struggling to cope. It's almost like a signal that says, I need some help and support. Whereas in the public sphere, it's very different. It's almost a kind of righteous indignation. So that was the first key. And then as economists, we thought, well, this is interesting because this reflects, in economics, you have macroeconomics, which is the kind of what's happening to the overall economy, the level of unemployment, budget policy. And then you have microeconomics, which is more about what's happening in your everyday life. And so this gave us that kind of lens. That's my daughter in the background.
Oh, sorry. Hello.
So we then had this kind of reflection of where the public was like a macro thing and the private anger was more like a micro explanation.
Okay. So when you then go on with the public, so I get that. So the private, if you're getting angry at home, you're stressed, or there's something, it's not necessarily right. And typically, if you've got private anger, it's not based on an injustice of some kind. It's like you're cross because your partner didn't empty the dishwasher, or someone drove too fast, whatever. And the public one, where you're allowed to get angry. And I know, because I spent many years ranting and raving on behalf of people against the banks, and I know all about righteous anger. I use it to fuel a lot of my stuff. Yeah. But the question I was going to ask you, because you then talk about tribes and you talk about devils and angels.
Yeah.
the thing that worries me is that I would be obviously, well, not obviously, but I would be quite left-wing. I used to be middle, and I've gone further and further to the left. Although I'm quite happy with, earning money and being a capitalist, but I wanted to be fairly, and all that stuff. But Trump supporters, for example, whom, obviously, well, again, if it's not obvious, I don't like Trump, but would they not think they're on the side of angels as well? So why is our viewpoint?
So let me go through this. So then within the public anger, as you said, we've got the anger of angels, the anger of devils. And what I'm getting at there is that the anger of angels is this moral indignation, this sense of injustice. This has a long history. If you go back and read Aristotle, which was the original philosopher who first talked about anger, he identified this notion of an appropriate response to a sense of wrongdoing. And in fact, if you listen to Cornel West, I don't know if you saw, he did an amazing interview on CNN. You should look at it on YouTube. Cornel West, I think he's a professor at Princeton. He's a sort of intellectual leader of the Black Lives Movement matter.
Oh, you have mentioned him, yes.
Yeah, and he one of the points he says is, what would it say about our society if we could witness police brutality like we can witness now on our screens, and there weren't people on the streets? What would that say about us? And that's an Aristotelian idea, which is that it's almost a measure of your moral compass. So that's the anger of angels, as it were. Now, the anger of devils is the football fan, right? And I realized this, funny enough, we did a data search where we got IBM is this big data system where you can search through hundreds of thousands of news stories, and it will sort the news stories by theme. And we got it to sort the news stories, hundreds of thousands, by anger. The second most frequent type of news story that cites anger refers to angry sports fans. Now, I don't know if you go to the football matches or the rugby or whatever, or any sporting event. Anyone who does, particularly if you go to football matches, you will go, that's totally obvious. Did you really need to do a data search to learn that? Right?
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, why do those people get angry? And I started going to football matches and studying the fans. And what's really interesting is we all assume they get angry at the opposition. That's kind of obvious. But they also get angry at their own players for not being committed enough, not being loyal. They get angry with each other for not singing loud enough, for lacking loyalty. I've been a season ticket holder for longer than you. And I realized that this is also an identity regulator, that there is an anger which is about tribal identity. And the reason we call that the anger of devils is, if you look at its function, it appears to be as a precursor to violence, right? It is a preparation for war. And if you look historically at sporting events, I mean, in ancient Greek and Roman times, sometimes the violence would be so overwhelming that thousands of people would be massacred, right? So we have to be very, very careful of this tribal rage.
And is it only football, or I would be more of a rugby follower, and I don't, and I know I went.
Well, I think there's a very interesting question. You can get into sports in terms of why fans may not be uniform across all different types of sports. So I don't think tribalism doesn't have to involve anger. I mean, there is a sense. I think we can, in a kind of self-aware sense, indulge in group identity in a benign way. I think you can, but we have to be very, very careful about it, because I suspect its function in human evolution is as a battle over scarcity. But to go back to the Trump supporters, Trump is very interesting because Trump doesn't just target the anger of devils. He also is very astute at triggering the anger of angels. I mean, you've got to remember, actually, he significantly won the US election by converting about 80,000 voters in the Rust Belt of America, which were the people who'd been ignored by Washington. They'd been ignored by the Democratic Party. They'd done nothing to change their lives. They've had stagnant real wages. They faced deindustrialization, manufacturing decline. And Trump went to these constituencies and he used moral arguments, right? He said, I am your voice, which is about representation. I'm going to represent you. He talked about the fact that there'd been deindustrialization. Part of the reason he began the trade wars is he said, I'm going to reverse free trade because it's cost you your jobs and your skills. And however, he will effortlessly go to a different constituency and start talking about marauding Mexicans and building a wall And he will actually, and he sends out little messages, and Farage does this as well, with the whole Brexit debate, which says, I'm also a tribalist, by the way, and I don't like people who don't look like me and don't sound like me. And I want to get you riled about that because, they're taking your jobs, etc. So Trump is very clever. The righteous indignation is not the domain of either the right, the left, or the center. It's all human beings. Wow. And so is tribalism. In fact, our desire to be tribal is such that we will often want to convert an ethical argument into a group one. We want to say I'm on the side of right and you're wrong, and convert it into a group argument.
I was speaking with somebody earlier today, and they made the very interesting point. They said that because Trump, and I'm going to move off Trump in a minute, but because Trump speaks out of both sides of his mouth, he'll say one thing here, nothing there. And then when he makes decisions, he can always look back and say, because he said both sides of the argument, it's very easy for him to say, well, I did say that back 2 years ago, even though he had totally said the opposite the previous year. And it's a very clever strategy. He's a very clever man. He didn't get there by being stupid. But sure. I don't want to waste time talking about Trump necessarily. I want to bring it back to the economics. And part of it you were saying is two things, like the 2008 crash.
Yeah.
And a lot, again, this is back to my home ranting territory where, the public purse bailing out the private banks and then the little man being squashed, and all those things were happening. And there was a feeling that the common man wasn't important anymore. Mm-hmm. So tell me, how do you think that changed our view of economics? Has it made us think differently?
This is really the political economy aspect in the book. So there's a very interesting question in a sense, which is why has tribalism gone global? Now, of course, if you grew up like I did and yourself in Ireland in the 1970s and 80s, we're familiar with tribal politics. Because in a sense, the Cold War allegiances of left and right didn't dominate Irish politics in the same. Ireland was sort of off on its own. Right? Mm-hmm. And the irony is, I don't know if we were ahead of the curve or behind the curve, or the curve was never even there. But the rest of the world has gone in that direction. And I think one of the reasons for it that we argue in the book is, in a sense, during the Cold War, there was a very strong sense that your representative represented your economic interest, that there was a difference between the left and the right. So it mattered who got into power, and it mattered to your life. And what happened in the 90s and the 2000s is it stopped mattering. You could change government and nothing changed, right? And in a sense, the issues that people were starting to care about, which I still think are there, inequality, the cost of recession and the impact of recession, who it hurts the most, the environment, no party actually really was interested in doing anything about them. There was a lot of talk, but actually there was a huge consensus that we wouldn't really change anything, we'd just tinker with it. And I think as a result of that, people just got totally disenfranchised. You see very low turnouts at elections. And that created a space for those politicians who wanted to get elected to shift the minority. And they realized very quickly that tribalism was the way to do it. And that's why I think you've seen the rise of populism. It also does genuinely reflect a failure of the political class to address people's real concerns.
Yeah, and you're right, because we were saying before we started recording, like basic income inequality is huge. And I see it in my generation, from my parents bringing up 6 kids in Dublin, and now trying to do the same. And it's a different ballgame. It is a totally different ballgame, and maybe we need more pandemics to try and sort this out. You also, looking then to move toward the economics in your book, and looking at you align the idea of capitalism with computers.
Yeah.
And you've got the countries, the hardware are the countries, and the ideas are the economic ideas. Is that my getting right? The software.
Exactly. So we got this idea. One way to make, economics can be a complex subject, and you want to try and make it accessible to people. And the way we think about it, in a sense, you can look at the history of the last 100 years of economics has broadly been the same hardware, which is free market capitalism. At least if you think depending on which side of the Berlin Wall. But if you think of the kind of the Western world, that it's been 100 years of broadly a similar system. But periodically we've changed the software. And the change in the software is, after the First World War, we created the welfare state. So we decided, as a result of John Maynard Keynes, great economist, to have more state involvement, a mixed economy. So a recognition that the private sector is very good at doing some things, but you need to have a state to provide insurance, protection, and stabilize the economy. Now, then in the 1970s, there was a problem which was stagflation. So you had high unemployment and high inflation. And then the software manual that was taken off the shelf was Friedman, which was the idea you need to deregulate everything, deregulate labor markets, deregulate product markets, remove capital controls, have global capital, and that everyone will benefit. And you then, now the interesting thing then is that model, which really prevailed until the financial crisis, has a huge crash. And every time the capital system has crashed, we've introduced new software and made big changes. On this occasion, we only we put a few patches, but we didn't really change much. So in a sense, the fundamental grievances that emerged during the financial crisis about inequality, the kind of nascent concern that's been growing about the environment, the costs of recessions, we haven't really done anything about that. And so that's what we're saying is interesting, is in a sense, we've lacked the ideas to rewrite the code and provide the system with some new software. And one other thing, and then in the final kind of 20% of the book, we put forward a set of ideas that we think would work as some new software. And the challenge we put to ourselves is we want ideas that are simple, ideas that will make a big difference quickly, that will actually address things, change people's lives, and ideas that aren't partisan. They don't fall neatly into left or right. Because if they fall into left or right, they're only going to last for 5 years, and then there'll be a change of government and they'll be gone. Yeah. So we wanted to, that was the challenge we set ourselves.
And your book is kind of timely because, like, one of the things you talk about is like helicopter money. And that's happened before the pandemic. Can you imagine government saying we're going to give everybody like a universal basic income?
Yeah.
Unheard of.
Indeed.
And the pandemic was enough to make it. And also, it does give me hope. We're saying about different governments. If the government could actually, here in Ireland, for example, they did a very good job. With the hospitals, they made space.
Yeah.
We flattened the curve. There wasn't the serve. All these things. Now, there's loads of mistakes were made too as well. We know about that as well. But acting in the information they had and the time frame that they had, amazing job. So I feel happy. For the first time, the pandemic makes me think that perhaps they can solve homelessness and they can solve the hospital crisis and all these stupid things that can be just with money. So your helicopter money idea, people are doing it. I mean,
they are doing it, and I think we could do an awful lot more. You're absolutely right. I think the pandemic has been an illustration of the old saying that where there's a will, there's a way. But in this situation, we had no choice because it was a pandemic. And part of the challenge, part of the challenge we're putting down in the book to politicians is, look, there's two big challenges to Western democracy at the moment. One is China, because to be honest, if you stand back and look at it, you go, well, the Chinese seem to have dealt with the pandemic better than anyone else, actually, in terms of lives saved. And they seem to have engineered an economic recovery that's better than anyone else's. So there's a big challenge as to which system is a better system. So that's challenge number one. We've got to get our act together quickly. And then the other challenge is, otherwise, our politics is going to go tribal, and it's going to be hijacked by populists. Because the populists have been gathering momentum, winning globally, and this is, fuel to their ire. And so this requires the kind of bravery and ambition of policymaking that we've seen during the pandemic. We need to see in more normal times to really provide an alternative that people have something that they can believe in and that they'll vote for.
You brought forward the idea as well, the National Sovereign Fund, like Norway has.
Yeah.
And obviously Norway got it from its oil reserves. But you're saying we can borrow so cheaply now, we could pay it back and still have the capital in like 10 years and invest it in people.
Absolutely. Well, we can invest, exactly. So I'll explain the idea to you. The first thing to bear in mind is that most of Norway's sovereign wealth fund now is not their original oil endowment. It's the returns that it's generated by investing actually in global capital. So, and what I mean by that is they were effectively, you're familiar with this because of your background, they invested in a diversified portfolio. So they ran it like an endowment. like there's the Wellcome Trust in the UK, or you look at the university endowments like Harvard or Yale in America, where they get a diversified investments in global stock markets, private equity, lots and lots of different types of investments that you can do globally. And they generated something around a 6% return on average, the Norwegians. And that is very similar to what Singaporeans have done, and we see the other endowments I've described. So my suggestion is, well, if you're a government and you can borrow at zero interest rates for 20 years, like the Irish government can.
And it's locked in for 20 years at zero, is it?
Locked in at zero.
That's I was going to ask that question when I heard you on the radio the day. Is it locked in?
Exactly right. So issue now.
Yeah.
And you repay in 20 years. Do a 20-year zero coupon at a zero interest rate. That means no capital repayment, no interest repayment for 20 years. And put it out to tender, set it up properly. It has to be an independent authority. We don't want the politicians interfering with it and giving favors, right? So you set it up as an independent authority. You have a board of trustees. You draw up a very clear mandate, which is, so say what the rules of corporate governance are going to be, what the target return is, and you put it out to tender to 5 or 6 global asset managers, and you say, we want this return objective, which is going to be a 4 to 6% return. We don't mind if there's volatility. We're going to take a medium-term view, and we're going to revisit it in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time to see what return it's generated. And as long as the world isn't hit by a meteor, it's going to deliver, we don't know, but probably somewhere between a 2 and an 8% return. Either way, you'll be able to repay significant amounts of the debt, and you'll be left with equity and value. And our suggestion is, you could do this within 6 months, set it up. You could distribute ownership in it, right? Distribute effectively shares in it to your population. Within 6 months, 80% of the Irish population who have very few assets would immediately be given a stake in the system. They'd be given a share, which would, depending on what the returns are like, will be a saving that they'll be able to draw down for housing, depending on your age, for retirement, for healthcare, for education. But more importantly, almost than that, is you've got a stake in the system.
Skin in the game.
Skin in the game, exactly. Now, you can decide that's left-wing because you care about inequality. You can say that's right-wing because it's shareholder capitalism. I think it's arithmetic. Right? If I can borrow at zero, all I have to, for 20 years, all I have to do is generate a positive return.
Yeah.
Right? That's not a big hurdle to ask.
Yeah. It's math. I like that. And actually, I've got one more question before I want to go on to the math. Actually, the math is why I like cryptocurrencies and blockchain, because it's math. Yeah. It's not about government.
You can't argue with it.
Yeah. But the other question you were saying too as well, another subject so close to my heart is monetization of our data. We know how the shared economies and like the Facebooks and all that, they screw all your data up and they take it up and they make money off you and they don't pay you back. And it's you were saying, slap a levy on one of the big ones. Of course, there are other platforms coming up, Uptrends. Have you heard of them? There again, where you earn money from, the money is shared, 50% of the token is shared within the community, and it's dependent on action. And Steemit was also another one that was set up by Larimer. So there are a few in the cryptocurrency world ideas where you can actually do it. But you're saying, look, there's Facebook there. Let's just slap a bill on them.
Well, no, my view is it's again because I think the clever approach here is to say, what's interesting about a lot of these big businesses that are tending towards the monopoly power, the big global tech companies, is the data is actually ours.
Yeah, it's the gold.
Now, so there's an interesting question. Why can't we exercise our property right if it's our data? So our proposal is let's auction our data. So the Irish government could say the Irish population has a stock of data. We're going to auction it to you, and we'll sell it to the highest bidder.
Okay, I like it even better.
Right?
That's.
So it's just like
that's why you're a macro hedge fund manager.
It's like the telecommunications companies when they would bid for spectrum, and you say this spectrum's available, or you want to run the 5G network or the 4G network, you've got to bid for it. So my view is our data. Why don't we strike a good deal for it? And to be honest, it would probably only generate, it depends on what value it is to these companies. It would generate a large amount of money, but once you converted that into an income for individuals, it would be a very small amount of money, but that's okay. I think what I prefer about this is a lot of people have problems with the idea of a universal basic income because it's money for nothing. This isn't money for nothing. This is money for my data. So you're paying a royalty, which is an exercise of a property right. And a lot of these issues are ultimately about how you frame it. So that's one of the ideas. And then the other point, you raised it about helicopter money. We think we could go a lot further than that. So we want, in the case of Europe, the European Central Bank to make perpetual loans to households every time the unemployment rate starts to rise. So this is borrowing from an idea that a US economist called Claudia Sam had. I don't know if you come across her. She's absolutely brilliant. Her view is the federal government should send checks whenever the unemployment rate starts going up. Checks should go out in the post. And it's a bit like a universal basic income, except it's not guaranteed all the time. It's there for you when economic times are hard.
And everybody gets it, or just...
And everybody should get it. And I think the European Central Bank could do this very easily. You do it as a loan, as a perpetual loan. So you say, I'll give you a perpetual loan at zero interest, which is something you never have to repay, and you don't pay any interest on it. And they could do that through the banks under their existing TLTRO scheme, and they could do that immediately. And you I would designate, 3 or 4 banks in every country, make them responsible for it. And whenever you think you've got a recession, you're going to miss your inflation target, you just credit every household with cash.
Do you know why that's so sweet? Your thinking is spot on. You marry traditional finance and the tools and things that we have already in existence. You're not creating new things. I keep going on about cryptocurrencies and blockchain, but you have whatever's there. But with innovative thinking, because I know when I was advocating a lot for the homelessness and anti-the-banks during the crash here, and people were getting their mortgages written off and other people were getting very cross. I'm going, well, why not give the same, so the person who works hard, who's not in danger of losing their house, why don't they get some similar benefit, a tax credit, so they're not going to feel bad, they'll be happy for their neighbor, because guess what? They get the same. I think that's the thing too as well, because when people are fighting, especially when they're fighting for their houses or they're low income, you can get very entrenched against your neighbor because your neighbor's gaming the system. All this type of stuff, stupid language that rich banks sort of perpetuate. But your thinking there is lovely. So everybody gets it.
Yeah.
So it floats up the economy, and it's only money.
The thing is, look, the beauty of the system, and this goes to the blockchain debate, the beauty of a system where you can create money out of thin air, which is actually what all civilized countries have done, and has been, Hume considered it to be as essential to the Scottish philosopher, that there were 3 spontaneous institutions: language, law, and money. And in a sense, and I think this is hugely underappreciated, so he would almost say the 3 pillars of our society are language. We get nowhere without language. We get nowhere without the law. And we get nowhere without money. We can create money out of thin air. Now, whenever there's a risk of falling inflation or deflation, the right thing to do is to create money out of thin air. Right? The only time you shouldn't do it is when you have inflation. Now, if you think the whole problem with a recession, this is the problem the European Central Bank is doing, is the inflation rate is way below their target. And at the moment, we have falling prices, falling wages, and falling prices of goods and services. So it's their job to print money. The problem is we're using a banking system and a monetary policy system that was set up 200 years ago, actually, to finance governments and do asset purchases and provide liquidity to banks. And we're using that system to try and stimulate the economy. What we should actually do is what we're trying to do is stabilize household cash flow and corporate cash flow. Do it directly. As Mark is a great way of describing the madness of QE. He says quantitative easing, it's a bit like trying to fill up your kettle by taking the garden hose, sticking it in the letterbox, right, and filling your house with water so that some of it flows into the kettle. Right? It's nonsense.
That's a very good analogy.
That's what we're doing with quantitative easing. We're hoping that we pump all this money into markets, which is my day job, and some of it will spill over into the household's cash flow, which it doesn't actually.
No,
let's just send the money out direct. We need to redesign the system. And it's actually, as you said, we have exactly the system in place to do this. Banks would be easily able to administer it. Now it can all be done virtually electronically. If you look in the UK, I looked into this because some people say, what about people who aren't banked? Well, we obviously need to make it accessible to everybody, and there's ways of dealing with that. It's still the case that about 95% of the adult population in the UK has a bank account. And that is greater reach of virtually any policy that's administered by a government entity. Like most policies, if one looks into them, don't reach 95% of their targets. Right?
Yeah.
So the reality is the reach of the banking system is considerable, but you can also provide availability to the 5% of the population that don't have bank accounts. They would have the right to the funds as well.
Of course. I love your thinking. I said, I am going to buy your book. I'm going to read your book because I'm very, very guilty only having watched and read and looked YouTube stuff, whatever. But it's your thinking that I adore. And yourself and Mark, you both have such a refreshing, and you're both economists. It's not as if like you're left-wing anarchists or right-wing anarchists or libertarians or, you know, any of those different sort of breeds that look at economics a bit differently. You're actually in the heart of the economies in different ways, obviously hedge funds and in lecturing, but you're thinking so differently. It's brilliant.
Sure.
Thank you. What would be the success of your book? Do you think will a party take it up? Is that how your book will be successful? Or
yeah, I hope. There's multiple ways I think about it. I think the typology of anger will help people to make sense of what's going on. It's helped me an awful lot, and that's been a lot of the feedback. You know, I'm not a psychologist. I'm still not an expert in anger. I've spent over several years researching it, and I've tried to synthesize the conclusions of the research. But I think the typology is really helpful, and a lot of people have got back to us and said, I was kind of aware that there was tribal rage and there was moral outrage, but I've never labeled them. And I do see this distinction between public and private. And all of a sudden, what I see on my screen is making a lot more sense. I can now categorize things. I can go, oh yeah, that's tribal, that's injustice. What's happening in people's private lives is different to the public. So that typology really helps. I think there's hopefully a very clear and intuitive to the non-economist explanation of how we've got to where we are in kind of politics and economics. And then you're absolutely right. We think there's a consensus growing amongst some enlightened thinkers about these policies. A national wealth fund to tackle wealth inequality. We talk about dual interest rates as well to get much more rapid environmental investment, which we desperately need. And also because we don't think it's zero sum. This is really important. My only argument with Greta Thunberg is she makes it feel as if it's doom and gloom. We are incredibly lucky that we have zero interest rates and an opportunity to do a huge amount of investment, right? Because virtually any investment we make in transforming our energy sector will generate a positive return, which means it creates value to the state if the state can borrow at zero. So we have a huge opportunity.
Yeah, and I think too as well, I think that really blows me away is that your suggestions, your solutions, they're equitable. You can be left, right, top, bottom, whatever hue or color that you are, and they're equitable. Wow.
Yeah.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you
very
much indeed. And go and buy the book. It's called AngryNomics. I'm going to buy it. I'm going to read it properly and then come back with some more questions.
I look forward to that.
That is absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for your time.
Not at all. Thanks, Gillian.